we'll let Liz take it from here.
All right, thanks, Pam. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
So welcome, everyone. It's great to have you join us virtually. We certainly look forward to when we can meet in person again. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So the webpage that Pam mentioned also has a written program update on it with a lot more information and web links directly to all the resources, case studies, meeting materials, etc., that we're going to mention here, and all the more that are on the sheet. So please go take a look at that. Next slide. So first of all, it is reporting season, and EDEP will be going live for this year's reporting at the end of the month. And they will also have the same kind of annual Form S training they had last year. It'll be online and on your own schedule, asynchronous style training. And that will also be available by the end of April. And of course, the changes to reporting doc, etc. Next slide. So speaking of reporting changes, just a reminder that nonylphenol ethoxylates were reportable under TRI for reporting year 2019, and they will be this year reports due this July for reporting year 2020 under TURA. And that category will be in the TURA chemical list that you see when you go to file. And there's also a link to the list of specific chemicals that are included in that category in the written update. PFAS, a big topic and one that you'll see is going to impact your reporting in a variety of ways. And we mentioned to you before about the EPA addition to TRI of some specific PFAS chemicals. There are 172 that are reportable under TRI for reporting year 2020. And they will be reportable under TURA for reporting year 2021. So you should be monitoring them this year and then reporting them next July. And that's for the longer chain and their precursors. And just a reminder that the precursors means that's the myriad of complex chemicals that are used in commerce that eventually break down into those alkyl acids that we find in the environment and in biota. And also they have one ether on that list as well. As EPA works their way through the many confidential business claims for PFAS chemicals, they're going to be adding more to that list. This is all under the National Defense Authorization Act requirement. And so they have already added 3 more, which will be reportable under TRI for reporting year 2021. TURA program will, as those come around, also be adding them to the TURA list. Typically, we'll be about a year behind EPA with those. If you are confused now about what year anything might be reportable, then not to worry. DEP is going to make all of that clear with their changes document, and on the chemical list, they will note when things are actually reportable. Next slide. So the PFAS is one of the things that are coming around. What you have that's reportable under TRI are those longer chain chemicals and one ether. The TURA program and the Science Advisory Board have been busy for more than 3 years looking at this category, and the Science Advisory Board has recommended a large category that you see the definition for here. And this includes the shorter chain like the PFBS that you see on the upper right, and some other ethers like you see on the bottom. And if this category were approved, then it would be a not otherwise listed category. So all those individual chemicals that EPA has put on with the low 100-pound threshold would still remain individually reportable. And if we added a large category, that would be everything that wasn't otherwise reportable. So that policy analysis is available on a variety of websites, and the link is in the written update. And we encourage you to go take a look at that. It's been evaluated or discussed by the Administrative Council and by the Advisory Committee, and they may be making a decision on that in the next several months. We will see. Next slide. So we have a lot of PFAS resources to help you out. This is true for the chemicals that are already reportable under TRI and anything that might be added. As you know, we have them throughout our environment. They're in a number of drinking water supplies. There are a lot of issues here. And we really want to highlight that the role of the TURA program is about prevention. It's about turning off the tap and trying to stop the adding of these substances into the environment and into our bodies. So I think there's a lot that we can do. There are things that we've started already. OTA has some resources for businesses as you comply with the TRI requirements and getting that information from your supply chain. And also they're doing some work with EPA. I don't know if you just got off the NUMOA webinar, but they were talking about the project that OTA is doing with EPA and others about monitoring wastewater and trying to go back up the pipe to see who might be discharging and helping those companies out. So the policy analysis is available. That will give you that kind of bigger picture overview of where the TURA program fits in, and also give you summary information about the hazards of the chemicals, how we understand that the precursor chemicals used in industry are breaking down into these ultimate degradation products that are remaining in the environment, and the ones we're finding in our drinking water, et cetera. And so, please do take a look at that. And if you have any thoughts or comments, then please let us know. There's a number of other things going on. TURA is involved with a project with the Lowell Center on firefighting foam, the AFFF foam, and looking at F3 or fluorine-free foam alternatives. And as I mentioned today, NUMOA had a webinar. They have some others coming up, and some of those webinars have been approved for TUR Planner CE credit, and that information is on TURI's website. Actually, it's on our calendar. Next slide. So the Science Advisory Board, what are they up to? They did finally finish their work on PFAS. They have been looking at quaternary ammonium compounds, which is actually another huge category, but they have restricted their investigation to two subcategories that are used in disinfectants, that ADVAC and DDAC. And so they are probably about to wrap that process up. They have been looking at a number of health effects and environmental effects of those chemicals, including asthma and respiratory issues, among a number of other endpoints. There's a lot of information on TURI's website on the Science Advisory Board page. And again, the link is on that written update. The program has also received a petition to list carbon nanotubes and carbon nanofibers, and the SAB has begun looking at those. So if you have information that could be helpful in that investigation, then please contact Heather Tenney. Excellent. We just want to give you a heads up. This is not a TURA law, but we think that there's always opportunities for source reduction and safer alternatives under TURA. So Mass DEP is implementing a new flame retardant law that just got passed on January 1st, an act to protect children's families and firefighters from harmful flame retardants. So Mass DEP has a web page that lists what those chemicals are that will be prohibited from sale on certain products. The regulations are in process. This law also requires Mass DEP to evaluate at least every 3 years in consultation with TURI and the Science Advisory Board on whether other flame retardant chemicals should be added to the list. And so I guess we'll stay tuned. You'll hear about that in the years to come. In the meantime, the TURA program is happy to assist Massachusetts businesses and Mass DEP with outreach and try to see who the impacted stakeholders might be and let them know about what the TUR opportunities are, including safer alternatives. Again, here, if you know of Mass companies that could be impacted by this, it would be helpful to let either OTA or Mass DEP know. Next slide. And there's always a lot going on in the TURA program. The request for proposals for grants for next year will be out later this month. We encourage you to think about TUR projects that you or your facility or your client facilities or something in your community that could use a grant, and would then in turn be willing to share that information about your experience in a case study or a demo site. And if you are signed up for TURA and OTA newsletters, you will make sure and get those kinds of announcements in a timely manner. And those links are also on that written update. Next. So again, there are lots of resources in that in the written update, and just to whet your appetite a little, there are things like a new diffusion dialysis case study. There's information about a metal mesh manufacturer who used an innovative brush system to reduce drag out and chemical use. We have companies that are substituting aqueous or safer solvent systems for TCE. And my favorite is the auto repair shop that eliminated more than 1,200 aerosol cans of degreaser that contained methanol, toluene, and other toxics, and instead went with an aqueous system. So there's lots going on, and please take a look at that other update. And now I think we're going to turn it over to Tiffany.
Great, thanks, Liz. So my name is Tiffany Skogstrom, and I'm the director of the Massachusetts Office of Technical Assistance. So the TURA program ad hoc strengthening committee has been meeting, and that was created by the Administrative Council in order to review experiences in the 10 or more years since the 2006 TURA amendments, and looking forward to the next decade of critical priorities in Massachusetts with respect to toxic chemicals and safer alternatives. So the objective of the TURA Program Strengthening Ad Hoc Committee is to review and strengthen the effectiveness and value of the TURA program activities and requirements to Massachusetts businesses, while ensuring ongoing progress in reducing the use of toxics in the Commonwealth and increasing the adoption of safer alternatives and materials. And so this is a group of stakeholders that have been meeting. Next slide, please. And these are the topics that they've been meeting. So there was an overall orientation in November of 2020, and that was an orientation, but also a refresher in general of the whole TURA program. In December 2020, we began with the topics of compliance and enforcement, and DEP discussed their experience with calling in some plans and reviewing them, and using that as an opportunity to improve planning and the targeting of program services and education. In January, we met and talked about alternative planning, specifically resource conservation, and trying to figure out how we can increase participation in the option in order to increase the productivity of the planning process. Most recently, on March 30th, we talked about toxic use reduction planning and planners, and we discussed quality control, continuing education, resource conservation certification, because TUR planning is really the backbone of an effective TUR process. In April, at the end of April, we'll be discussing chemical lists. In 2006, the amendments provided for higher hazard and lower hazard substances and changed the priority user segments provision. So we're going to be talking about how that's worked so far and how we maintain a current and relevant chemical list. And then our last topic will be fees. And then there was a provision in the 2006 amendments for the council to review. A proposal was made but never acted upon, and the fees haven't really changed in 30 years. And as we're having these meetings, background documents are being created, and those are available on the links in your TURA program update that's available online. Next slide, please. So we've had some staff changes. Many of you know that in November, I became the director of OTA and also the executive director of the TURA Administrative Council. And then sadly, we have a retirement. Marina Gale has been offering technical assistance to Massachusetts businesses for 29 years. So she started in 1992 as an intern, and she's been a real valuable resource. She's mentored many new staff, including myself when I came in. And she's just helped out a lot of companies. So we're sad to see her go, but we're really happy that she's going to be able to enjoy her retirement starting in spring. But if you know Marina, please drop her a line. And next slide. So, OTA, we really rely on doing site visits, and it's been really difficult during a pandemic. So we've been evolving and adapting to attempt to provide as much virtual site visits. So staff have been working via Zoom to provide technical assistance to companies. And they're also providing, help by phone and email. And we are still here. We're still available. As a matter of fact, we do a lot of meetings by Zoom, even if they're not site visits. So we're utilizing technology, and the forms of assistance that we offer are toxic use reduction, regulatory and compliance, resource conservation, pollution prevention, identifying PFAS products. So that's something that we're really, as Liz mentioned, we're asking companies to use us to help them identify if they're using PFAS, so that we can help them find safer alternatives, and not use it anymore. Next slide. And then environmental justice has been a really important topic for OTA. The Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which houses OTA, has created an EJ task force. So each agency has really been asked to look at what we do through an environmental justice lens. So in hindsight, in fiscal year 2019, OTA looked back and realized that 44% of the companies that we worked with are within environmental justice communities. So we're making attempts to more thoughtfully provide resources to the environmental justice communities. Some example of that is, just training staff on, like looking at their work through an environmental justice lens, noting when we're actually working in an environmental justice community. And then we're also attempting to develop relationships with environmental justice groups and economic development groups within EJ communities, helping minority-owned businesses, and seeing if we can get more referrals or make boards of health and fire departments more aware of their ability to refer companies to OTA for technical assistance and toxic use reduction in EJ communities. And then, we're also looking at the impact of toxic use in climate change vulnerable areas, which are also often environmental justice communities. How can we help reduce the use of toxics in order to prevent industrial accidents that might impact EJ communities? So there's a social justice impact to that. Next slide, please. And then this is our contact information for TURA, OTA, and DEP. And we will leave that up okay. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Ana Mascareñas, who is our keynote speaker. And so Ana Mascareñas was appointed to the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, First Assistant Director for Environmental Justice in May of 2015. In May of 2019, she was named Environmental Equity Deputy Director to lead the department's environmental justice, public participation, and tribal affairs programs. Ana serves as the DTSC's tribal liaison. And before coming to the department, Ana was a membership coordinator and then policy communications director at Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, where she promoted environmental justice, environmental health protections, and fought for social and environmental justice in local, state, and national policy efforts. From 2006 to 2008, Ana served in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. offices for then Congressman Xavier Becerra, directly assisting constituents in their claims and applications with federal agencies. She was also a member of the East Los Angeles Residents Association Board of Directors from 2007 to 2015, where she organized alongside community, youth, and business leaders to improve social, educational, economic, and structural resources through advocacy and civic engagement. Ana graduated from Brown University with a bachelor's degree in human biology and sociology, and received her master's of public health and environmental health sciences from the Fielding School of Public Health at the University of California, Los Angeles. Ana was born in Northern California and raised in New Mexico, and we're really pleased to welcome Ana Mascareñas and teach us more about the intersection of toxic use reduction and environmental justice, because it certainly applies to the work that we do here in Massachusetts. So thank you and welcome, Ana.
Thank you, Tiffany, for the introduction. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you today. And just by way of introduction, I want to thank everyone at UMass Lowell for hosting me actually back in 2009, which really kickstarted a lot of my interest and better understanding of alternatives assessments and toxics reduction when I had just started at Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. I went for a week-long program. I think I saw Joel Tickner sign on here, and was very inspired by the idea of prevention, getting to the root cause of why toxics are in our environment and our workplaces and what we can do systematically to reduce them together. So it feels very, I feel privileged to be speaking with this group today and to share some thoughts and information and hopefully resources on the next steps in the work that you're doing. So I also had a chance to work right after that trip to UMass Lowell in state and national efforts around toxics and flame retardants. And it was great to hear about the TURA update earlier. And we really were advocating to change flammability standards in California. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of those efforts a handful of years ago. And that led me into a space of wanting to continue serving in public policy and changing policy and to position at Department of Toxic Substances Control. So our main areas, in addition to safer consumer products, which looks very much up at the upstream, as you all do, there are programs we have in hazardous waste law enforcement, permitting, and site cleanups. So as referenced a little bit earlier as well, a lot of my inspiration and commitment to working in environmental justice and being privileged to work in the space comes from family upbringing. And we'll talk a little bit more. I'll invite you all to share a little bit about yourself as we jump into the presentation as well, and what it means to really be thoughtful about where each of us are coming from with our experiences, honoring those experiences in order to really engage and work alongside environmental justice communities. One last tidbit is this past year has been challenging for so many people in so many communities. I have during the pandemic also started sourdough and raising chickens. And I thought when we talk about sharing information and all the things that have changed over the past year, we're usually in person for these types of things, learning more about each other. I hope that resonates with some of you as well. So for topics today, I wanted to share some thoughts around there's a lot of terms that are interrelated with environmental justice, and walk through some of them, what my perspectives are, where I would recommend you seek more resources and learning about those, why equity, why environmental justice, learning more about the legacy of redlining, which many of you may know about, and there have been excellent resources that have popped up over the past year that shed more light on what that means for equity and EJ work. Also sharing resources around the community engagement spectrum and engaging with communities, some guidance and frameworks, and really this intersection of toxics use reduction and equity. And what I see and feel and inspired by a handful of years ago, really closing the equity gap, and by way of reducing toxics systematically, and a lot of good work that continues in what you're doing. So I'm going to ask folks to participate in some polling for today. So we're going to take just a minute to get oriented. I'm not sure how many of you may have used Poll EV before. You can join by a website, which is pollev.com, and then you enter Engage 2021, or you can pull out your phone and text to 22333. So you can also use a phone web browser. If we take just a moment here to set it up, I hope that a lot of you can connect to these polls. It's so challenging with our virtual meetings to be able to engage and kind of get a sense of what folks in the room are thinking. This is an anonymous poll actually that I've set up just to get an idea of the experiences and perspectives from people who are participating in the training session today. So I'm going to ask you all to please join pollev.com and then enter Engage 2021. As Pam observed earlier when she was joining and testing this out, you go to and enter that username, Engage 2021. You should not have to sign up for any email or enter any other information. This is just an anonymous polling session that we're starting right now.
And Anna, I just put the information into, oh, it says, the phone option says code isn't the right word. Give it a try again. Maybe it's not all caps. Go ahead, Anna. I think you can go ahead and activate it. I'll try to handle this.
Okay. You know what? It's text Engage 2021.
Is that true for the, okay, it's not, okay, so text Engage 2021. Thank you.
Not sure why it showed up on the, sorry about that. So at the top of this screen, you should be able to see how to join. We have 22 people responding. Thank you so much. We're going to use this polling for a couple parts of the presentation today. So thanks for taking a moment to join in. And I'm starting with this question on implicit bias because I think it's an important place to start with so much that's happened around the pandemic and our nation's really different understanding, renewed understanding of civil rights, racial inequities, and really coming to terms and expanding, I think, and recognition of histories and ongoing discrimination that's taking place today. And so we start with implicit bias and introducing some more terms. I just want to get a sense of how many here have taken implicit bias training. Should be able to see the results coming in here.
Yeah. And then I just added in the chat, if anybody is having a hard time accessing either the online or the phone version, you can just type your answer into the chat.
Thank you. And so in my organization at DTSC, we actually completed implicit bias training recently for all 980 employees and found it was a minimum 2 hours. We're planning on doing this ongoing, and really for any organization, a very, very important, healthy conversation to have with our teams. And so implicit bias, also referred to as unconscious bias, really becoming more self-aware that everybody carries biases. As our trainer, Dr. Bryant Marks from the National Institute on Training Center on Race and Equity drilled into us, if you're human and you have a brain and you live in society, then you're gonna have some type of implicit bias. And so it's about acknowledging and learning about your biases and mitigating them, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So it looks like many of you have not taken formal implicit bias training. I'd highly recommend thinking about that for your organizations. And jumping into these ideas around justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, implicit bias, very, very uncomfortable a lot of times. You're learning, it can be messy to open up these conversations with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. And so I just want to encourage you all through this session and many other important conversations just to keep an open mind, and that this internal work and this organizational work really does make a difference in better engaging with your workers, your teams, your communities, and environmental justice overall. One thing that I have reflected on quite a lot over my past 5.5 years at DTSC is that constant self-awareness and self-work and training is important when you're working to engage communities in a thoughtful, honest way. And so that's my ask and my recommendation for you all, just to be okay with being uncomfortable in some of the conversations, seek more training. I'm just going to really touch on high level topics here for our session today, but encourage you to learn more about these topics, starting with looking for an implicit bias training for your organization. And culture. Culture is underlying so many things. As a way to get to know you a little bit better as well. I just wanted to share, there are many definitions of culture, but really that culture is something that is learned, reflects values, behaviors, and culture changes. And over this past year, we have seen a number of different types of culture change, and how that reflects in the work you do and the work you do with your teams and your organizations also connects more broadly to environmental justice and social movements. So we present ourselves, if we were all sitting in a room together, then we might have some visual cues about each other's cultures and identities. I've listed a couple of the ways that I identify and that I consider my culture here. And I'm going to invite you in this next poll, since we have so many of you who successfully signed into the poll, to pick one identity to share today. So this one is showing up as a word cloud. Woman, father, engineer, independent, mother. Time. The word cloud splits up multiple words, so you may want to squish them together. This is really wonderful to see. And so we think about how we identify, how we each bring multiple identities and perspectives to our workplaces, to our communities, and then how that expresses in the work that you all do. And when we think about and start planning, engaging with communities and thinking about equity. I love that superhero is on here.
I just did this. I just put that in the chat. That's so cool. Way to go.
Wonderful. I'm gonna save this. Thank you.
Thank you.
So talking through some of the terms, because what I've experienced is over the past months, a lot of the terms are around diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and many conversations kind of all coming together and being used interchangeably, when I would encourage everyone to really think through how they're different and connected. And so there's a lot of momentum towards better understanding diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice work, and just sharing that diversity really is limited to the way people are different. And there are some examples here, but there are so many different dimensions. It could be diversity of thoughts and perspective, diversity of cultures and identities, but it is just the presence of differences. And I like to think about inclusion as what you really do with your diversity. It's about where you create spaces to form communications, you structure your communications and interactions in a way that really welcomes people, where people feel respected and supported and fully valued. And so that's a lot of organizational work, and in your interactions with your colleagues and your friends and your families, about how people are feeling welcome, supported, and respected. And this is really important in my mind when thinking about how we really engage respectfully, effectively, and meaningfully with communities, and especially environmental justice communities who have experienced a number of marginalizations and lack of access to important resources, that how we interact with our team members, our employees, is really, it will be an iteration of how we reach out to communities as well. And I've seen this in many different organizations and in the work I currently do, where if our teams aren't feeling supported and aren't communicating, and we're planning an engagement and trying to really be thoughtful, we really have to model that as our own organization, as our own team. How we interact with each other is going to very much be a microcosm of how we are interacting with communities. So engaging with your employees, not just, and asking and thinking about biases and guiding questions, not just asking yourself those questions, but every person throughout the organization, regardless of rank or status. And because equality and equity are often used interchangeably, just a few minutes to share thoughts and some definitions around equity. There's an image here, and there's many iterations of this image, but I think it really does help illustrate for folks who haven't seen these representations before what equity is really about. And there's another image I'll share next in a slightly different way, but it's about seeking and supporting and tailoring methods so that people have equal access. And it's providing the resources really so that groups can, whatever situation, and people, whatever situation they're in, can really have that experience of equal outcomes and opportunities. I borrowed this image as well from thank you for the suggestion, Karishna, from a couple different designers, but obviously coming from Shel Silverstein. Equality versus equity, really seeing that if we provide everybody with the same thing, that gets to fundamental understandings of fairness and people's perspectives and life experiences around fairness. But if we are being very thoughtful and intentional about equity, it is recognizing that not everybody has the same tools and access, and the structure is not set up for everybody. So if you give the same ladder, but the tree is looking a lot different, it will not result in equity, which is what a lot of the conversation nationally and in our communities is about. And folded in here are concepts around racial equity. And there's an executive order, which I'll share a little bit more about. Actually, the first executive order issued by this administration was around racial equity. And the idea of racial equity is such that race, the goal really was that race should no longer be used as a predictor of life outcomes. And so all of the activities and work and structures that can contribute towards that. In our context, reducing pollution, expanding opportunities, because right now there continues and persists a disparity in life outcomes based on race. And there's intersection, of course, a lot with environmental justice and the intersection of toxic waste reduction, which we're talking about here today around environmental justice. And I think of environmental justice and was very fortunate to join DTSC to move forward principles of environmental justice. And just in the past year and a half, really having a broader understanding and welcoming of the roots of environmental justice as a very positive and value-based, wonderful goal to have within private businesses, within government agencies, but really recognizing the history of environmental justice as a social movement that was developed in response to environmental racism, where we have many studies and information. Toxic Waste and Race is a seminal report, just really detailing the disparities around siting of hazardous waste landfills and other environmental hazards, and intentionally and unintentionally, and concentrating in low-income communities of color. So Dr. Robert Bullard, often referred to as one of the fathers of environmental justice, defined environmental racism as really any practice, policy that differentially affects or disadvantages based on race. And sharing a resource with you and how we really need to be thoughtful and learn more about the legacy of environmental racism. Redlining is part of this country's history that is extremely important to understand and helps us problem solve and think through how we change some of these structural inequities that have developed over time. So there's a website link here that you can click on. I would encourage you all to do this. And it provides some background. It's called Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America. And it's part of a larger study, and there are a number of researchers across the country who took a look at some of the maps, some of the guidance that was from Federal Housing Administration in the 30s, and took a look at how that information, organized by local real estate professionals, lenders, real estate appraisers, but in conjunction with the federal government, denied mortgages based on color coding from hazardous to safe neighborhoods across the country. And so this made it difficult for people who are, of course, in certain areas to become homeowners, and it had a direct and intentional impact on public and private capital to white families and away from African-American and immigrant families. So I'd encourage you to click on this link. It's dsl.richmond.edu/panorama/redlining if you can't click on it, and look up where you grew up or what city you currently live in. And if you want to take a moment, you can share in the chat here. I know that there are certain areas of Massachusetts that do come up on the map. You can look where your business is located. You can see perhaps where the area you grew up. And there's very, very disturbing and very, very clear descriptions about what was redlined and why. And that is a history and a legacy that has continued to affect opportunities and where our society has placed environmental hazards from decades past. So this is a group of researchers. They launched this project just a couple months ago, and there's a number of great resources. And cities across the country are also making more specific maps. They digitized these from the 1930s. If there's anything you want to share in the chat, please feel free to.
I think this is a really interesting tool for people to look at with respect to where their companies are located.
And so questions to consider is the historical redlining or greenlining or whatever color coding in the area of where you currently live or where you grew up different than where your business is located? And why might that be? So building on this information that's been digitized and shared to really visualize the legacy of redlining and where businesses and homes and cities and developments have grown, we have used some of the EJ tools. So I know that Massachusetts has an environmental justice map that identifies based on demographic criteria EJ communities. And in California, we have a screening tool called CalEnviroScreen. And here's another link you can click on and start exploring, which is what overlaying the historically redlined neighborhoods and the relationship between present day environmental injustice. And so the California screening tool takes a look at socioeconomic indicators and vulnerability along with pollution burden and creates an indicator. But for any definition of environmental justice community that we have across this country, you can overlay in this second resource here and see a correlation and see that there are alignments about the present day environmental justice impacts and historic redlining. And there's continued research. I really appreciate the work that's been done by researchers across mapping inequality, and then a number of my colleagues at Kelly PA to create these. I sent here a second resource as well, where there's ongoing research related to climate about urban heat islands and their prevalence in formerly redlined neighborhoods and other areas. To reflection questions. If you'd like to share in the chat, you're welcome to. You can also make these notes for yourself, but I encourage you to think about the differences of maybe where redlining history, where your business is located versus where you grew up, where you currently live. And then moving us into the space of how what we see and observe and hear from communities directly about environmental injustices and how they align often with redlining and other policies that have taken place over time. How is it that we can start remedying those? And what actions can we take towards that? I understand a number of you probably know and work with local EJ and community organizations. Really encourage you to get to know your local community and EJ organizations if you don't already, seeing each other as partners and seeking equity and recognizing and understanding the legacy of policies like redlining and how that affects your businesses, your neighbors, and environmental justice that you see today. And Pam, I'm not able to see the chat, so feel free at any point if someone is raising a question to interrupt me.
Oh, thanks, Ana. Yeah, so there's some interesting conversation going on about this mapping, and we're talking about how old those maps are. So the 1930s, the 1940s, and so the redlining done in the 30s continues to have an impact on the areas in which we live. And how do those earlier property evaluations affect how certain communities are or are not able to access the security of housing as an appreciating asset? So it's eye-opening. Many people are noting that where they live or grew up isn't mapped because there's probably a lot of rural areas.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad to hear that folks are exploring that tool, and it really has over the past year been expanding as an area of research. So maybe the area that you grew up in can be researched and brought to life with researchers in your local areas, but it's taken a team of people to digitize this information and then start drawing those connections. We have excellent tools available to all of us now with GIS. So if you aren't finding information from your area, I encourage you to reach out to the research team to see if there are others who might start looking into it. If you can be a part of that. So we're going to move into another poll as everyone's reflecting here. And so I encourage you to think about, these are anonymous responses. This one's not a word cloud, it's a open-ended question. How might the legacy of redlining affect the way you understand and interact with communities? And it looks like a number of these reflections are happening to the chat, which is great. Thank you. And if you'd like to share any here on the poll, please do. Still very curious about how significantly it's changed the city, sensitivity, medical legacies clusters. Awareness. And really having these tools available, especially visual and mapping tools, opens up these data and connections and ability to start answering or sharing observations that often line up with asking communities directly about legacy and impacts of what's happened in communities. So there's a lot of thoughtful statements people are sharing here. Thank you. So please do feel free to share these resources. Our colleagues at US EPA have also been sponsoring webinars and speaker events open to everybody about these tools especially. And systematic, okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, if people are interested in attending some of those, we can make sure to alert our audience about some of those trainings that EPA is doing that might be interesting for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I can share a list of those, and I think some other ones that have popped up. And there's a question observation that came up about how our current zoning efforts may be related to redlining. And if you click on the story map from the Cali PA research team, there's, I think, a deeper delve into how some of the very explicitly racist language that was early on in those maps of, naming ethnic groups as racially hazardous and aggressive, that as those federal documents changed over time, they kept the same format of avoiding these areas, but just soften the language to not be so explicitly racist. So there's an examination about how over the decades, some of those guidance documents look very much the same structurally, but just the language has been changed to not be so explicit over time. So whoever submitted that comment, I encourage you to take a look at the Cali PA site about how that's how the evolution has happened. Thank you all. And so in thinking about being in any community, your place of business, your family, your neighborhood, I wanted to share this as a resource as well, because there's a lot of well-intended and thoughtful community engagement that takes place in public and private sectors. And I find this, it's adapted actually from the San Francisco Department of Environment, but I find this to be a kind of good tool to check when we're thinking about engaging and wanting to be thoughtful and respectful and clear about the goals of engagement with communities' time and resources. So many of you may be familiar with just a general public participation engagement spectrum, and this gets a little more specific about what your engagement goal is, what your messages might be, and then the last row, very importantly, is talking about what that means in terms of resource investments. So this is, starting with ignoring, that's marginalization, ignoring, that's not where we want to be, but very important to be explicit that there are processes where we have closed door meetings, where there's voter suppression, and that is zero on community engagement, and that we are clear that when we do that, we're letting folks know that their voices don't matter and their interests don't matter. And so moving to the right of the spectrum, a lot of what I can at least speak for myself and my own agency, a lot of what we do is inform people of something that's happening. And that's important, but it's also very important to be very clear that it is a one-way communication. Fact sheets, open houses, videos, that's information sharing, and that's important, but it doesn't reach other goals. But there are some instances where this might be the right fit for the community engagement goal, especially if the community is asking to be informed, not necessarily have more direct involvement. The last row here, systems admin means generally just what it takes to staff and administer this type of work. So it's very heavy on an organization, public or private, putting together information and then kind of pushing out these messages. We start moving further to the right with consulting, gathering input from the community, also important. And we care what you think is the message that communities hear from that perspective. More time should be spent, 20 to 40% of time on consultation activities. There's examples of what those activities are here. Involving is what I think are a goal often is, that we want to involve people and make sure that their voices are heard. There's a lot more interactive workshops, community forums, polling as activities, and this is where you start really seeing, and where about half of your time and resources should be on administering as staff of any public or private entity, and the other half starting to move towards community involvement and direct allocation of resources into community involvement. And of course, collaborating, you start delegating power. And that's a very difficult conversation for folks and I'm sure public and private sectors about sharing power, where we have roles and responsibilities and accountabilities in many, many ways. And when you open up a process, you are opening up some power sharing. So you're working with MOUs, perhaps with community advisory committees, and that really you start investing more of those resources directly to community partners. And this last here, I think is pretty rare, but this is a more full community ownership of issues. And so I hope that you have some time to think about when, I know that for teams I work with, I pull out this guide and this chart from the beginning of any community engagement so that we can all be very clear and honest with each other of the types of resources we're going to invest and the type of community engagement goals that we can really achieve. Because if we say that we're going to collaborate with community partners, and especially in environmental justice communities, what we really mean is we're just going to inform them, that could be very disingenuous and harmful to relationships about community engagement. So the next 10 or 15 minutes, I was hoping to share more resources and connect the concepts around equity, justice, the implicit bias work into some of the frameworks and tools on environmental justice and toxic use reduction. And so many of you may be familiar with Executive Order 12898. That was in 1994 and really spurred a lot of policy around environmental justice, and at the states level, spurred a lot of state level policies. I was reading more about recent efforts in Massachusetts, which is really exciting, and that climate and environmental justice legislation has recently been passed. But looking at the national policy setting in 1994, and then most recently that first executive order that came out from this administration, which is advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And just on March 29th, actually, the White House announced White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So there are a lot of resources being shared right now, a lot of ways to open up and connect thinking of historic injustices and how we can start putting in place equity lens and equity solutions. And so I encourage you to read through these if you haven't already. And a framework I wanted to share as well today is a very kind of distilled version of thinking through environmental justice. And I appreciate the incredible tools that that TURA and many of you all have shared with each other in planning tools over time. I hope this becomes one of them if it isn't already, but a 4-point framework on environmental justice. And so when many people think of environmental justice communities, across any of the definitions of states or federal, you think of engagement. I just showed a slide that talks about community engagement, and that is important. It's often referred to as meaningful involvement, and that is a type of procedural justice that you invite and you involve people in decision making. What's extremely important is the concept of benefits and burdens, which is where through the example of redlining, we've seen historic burdens being concentrated in certain communities, and benefits and other types of tools you can see concentrated in other areas. So that's a form of distributive justice. And you can have process and community engagement, but if you are not taking a step back and looking at where your benefits and burdens are being placed, then you aren't seeking this aspect of distributive justice in this 4-point framework on EJ. And moving through some of the more recent literature and practices around environmental justice, we talk about vulnerability of any community. And I think that Massachusetts environmental justice tools really speak to demographics and access and vulnerability. And those are systemic and structural issues that are important to keep in this conversation and keep in consideration. And then disproportionate impacts, which is another form of systemic and structural environmental injustice, and one of the most difficult ones for agencies and I'm sure folks in public and private sectors to really work through. There are disproportionate impacts in communities, and what tools, what information, what resources do we have to address that, to not only be mindful and thoughtful, but to really change the situation so that disproportionate impacts are not taking place. And there's entire legacies in history that we're building on, but it is the concept really of equity that is underlying environmental justice. So this is a 4-point framework that's used very widely and wanted to share with you today. And the intersection of these kinds of tools and sharing some guiding questions, where we think of environmental justice in its most basic first goal of preventing harm. And I think it's really, really important that the work of TURA and the work that you all are doing is based on that principle of preventing harm and taking a look at our practices and if something is really necessary. And so it is, I would argue, equity environmental justice work to really have that front of mind of reducing toxic exposures, of really looking upstream. So I commend you all for that. And again, this work and space that you're in is what inspired me to be in the work that I've been doing in California. And here are 4 guiding questions that I also wanted to share today. And these are very concise questions, but in planning and thinking of any action that you'll be taking, to really challenge yourself to think through these questions and then open up for other perspectives. Ask your colleagues, ask the workers in your company, in your organization, ask the communities you're working with. If you were to take this action, who would be experiencing the benefits, the burdens? What strategies can you use to mitigate or avoid the direct or unintended consequences, especially for the communities who we saw in these previous tools impacted by the historic redlining and present day environmental injustices? And decision-making, who is at that decision-making table and who is absent? These are, again, 4 concise questions, but I would encourage you to build them in as an equity consideration into any process. It works through burdens and benefits, process, procedural justice, and then also what strategies might we employ to avoid those. And in the context of toxics and toxics use reduction, there's a lot of planning and reporting that's been very important in seeking the mission and the goals of toxics use reduction. But what more can you do? how can you better involve EJ communities? If you aren't already working with your local EJ organizations, community-based organizations, how might you reach out? It's really important to work with advocates, work with activists and community members directly, because situations change. Obviously, this has been a very challenging year for many, many vulnerable communities, and it's extremely important to speak directly with communities when you're taking actions that will be affecting them directly. One more might be able to do around benefits and burdens. There's a lot of really excellent guidance around contributing to an overall reduction in toxics burden and vulnerability, being aware of what are the structural issues that contribute to vulnerability in any community, and disproportionate impacts. Again, I'll share a couple other resources around historical trends and policies, such as redlining, and how can you be an even bigger part of closing that equity gap? Is there more that you can do to bring down the disproportionate impacts that you see built on these historic practices? And there's a paper that came out last month, Environmental Law Reporter by Charles Lee, who's a senior advisor in US EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. And I really recommend taking a look at this paper, where we're building on the work of environmental justice advocates, communities, and people from many different sectors who are looking to integrate environmental justice into daily practices and decisions, and looking at disproportionate impacts in particular, and how those impacts can be addressed head on in a way that we have not really been able to, I think, on a national level, discuss until the more recent change in direction. And so I encourage you to take a look at this article. It also gives a good kind of across the nation review of different types of EJ mapping tools, and how we can start with identifying EJ communities, and then what's the next step? And then how do we take a look at what impacts they're experiencing, and how we might integrate equity into next actions. And those concepts are really tied very closely to cumulative impacts. And I included here for reference the Cali PA's working definition from 2005 on cumulative impacts. And I haven't had a chance to really learn more about the most recent Massachusetts definitions and policies, but I was very inspired by what's been passed and some of the opportunities. But cumulative impacts, different from cumulative risk, really this definition came together through a statewide environmental justice advisory committee, is intended to look at the cumulative exposures, public health, environmental, socioeconomic, from all sources of pollution. And so in the interest of hoping to solve problems and think about systems, sometimes we put aside, this is an air pollution issue, this is a hazardous waste issue, that's how many of our regulatory systems are built. But from a community and public perspective, it all comes together. And we have limited tools, we've had limited tools to be able to address that in risk assessment. And I appreciate the work that all of you are doing to look at how to reduce from the onset toxics in many of the situations. So cumulative impacts is also referenced in some of the policy initiatives that are being passed in Massachusetts. I look forward to learning more from all of you about what that means. I actually just inserted one of the sections from the recent legislation. If you all hadn't had a chance to look at it yet, I believe this was just passed on March 26th, and you can see integrated in here, I believe it's the first time, and this is codified through legislative processes, equitable distribution of energy and environmental benefits and environmental burdens. And so that's a big statement, and that's a big challenge. We've had this type of direction through public and private sectors for some time, but how do we build in an equitable lens, equitable distribution of those burdens and benefits? Reducing toxics is one of the intersections, but how else in your daily work can you think of strategies of how your teams and your leaders can be more self-aware about what more we can do about the legacy of injustices that we're working from for many communities. So I encourage you to take a look at this information, and would welcome learning more as well. There actually is at least one of the local environmental justice organizations who was just appointed from Massachusetts into the White House Council Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. It's really exciting, and encourage you to get to know your local EJA and community organizations. And I wanted to leave a little bit of time for some dialogue and questions that may have come up, and apologize that I don't have a setup where I can easily see the chat. But this is a quote that some of you may be familiar with. And I wanted to tie back to some of the conversation from the beginning around terms and culture. And I believe it was Peter Drucker who said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I think I'm reminded of this quote by one of my mentors, because we have lots of tools and lots of strategies, but if we don't consistently chip away at and understand and bring into context the culture of who's implementing these strategies and what work we've done to be self-aware, to be aware of our biases, to be aware of how to mitigate those biases, then those strategies ultimately won't be successful. So thank you for inviting me again to be a speaker in your continuing education conference today. And I look forward to some of the questions and more sharing of information.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's really learned a lot right here about environmental justice and equity and bias, and importantly, like, how can we be thinking about our work and our impacts. So I want to invite people to go ahead and ask questions. So one thing that you can do is you can start your video and I'll see you show up, or you can go to the participants link on your screen and raise your hand. So if you have a question, please let me know, or you can just go ahead and unmute yourself. I see Tim and Bill. Tim, did you have a question? Nope, you're just saying hi. Bill, did you have a question? No, you did. You're just saying hi. Lucy, did you have a question?
I have a question.
Great.
So Anna, that was wonderful, inspiring, and insightful. And I'm wondering what DTSC is doing perhaps to help companies in California to attack this whole issue, you know, and thinking, how can the TURA program help our companies? What are you doing to help yours?
Thank you, Liz. That's a really fantastic question. And, you know, there's a lot of effort and attention that's been placed on our Safer Consumer Products program since the time I've been at DTSC. And that's been a really specific approach in you know, trying to build on putting in place these requirements from the legislation that was passed in California about 10 years ago now. And we have ongoing technical assistance, but we actually are in the process now with our legislature of developing proposals to expand the pollution prevention efforts and create statewide hazardous waste management plans very extensively. So there's, I think, been a kind of a baseline ongoing consultation with some of the businesses in California, but really, quite honestly, it's been about 20 years since we've had the type of matching with resources to be able to provide the assistance to businesses that I think a lot of our business colleagues really are asking for and have been asking for from the department. So we're in the middle of budget hearings right now to better match those resources, because there has been a gap. There's a lot of excellent work that's been done through pollution prevention before I joined the department, but the past 5 or 6 years we've seen this gap growing, and that's something that I know a number of our colleagues want to put more investment in.
So I'm just so Anna, you can't see the chat, but lots of thanks and great presentation. A lot of comments about how much people have appreciated what you've presented and how much it's made them think. So that was the goal. So well done. Any questions for Ana or also for Liz, Tiffany, or Veronica, who's here with us from DEP? Now's a great time to just pose any questions that you might have.
And book recommendations.
Yeah, this is Christine. I just had a question for Ana.
Go ahead, Christine.
I noticed when I was looking at the Massachusetts EJ maps, was that surprisingly, I guess they had done, there's three different categories, and one of them's economic, one of them's minority, and then you have minority and economic.
Mhm.
And I didn't really consider in all of my years of dealing with EJ from, you know, Illinois and stuff, that some of these minority communities are actually fair.
Your audio is cutting a little in and out for me. I'm not sure if it's just on my end. Christine, can you say that last part, please?
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you find that in California as well, where you're dealing with some higher income communities that are high minority, and that you still are dealing with them on the same level of the EJ communities, where I have always considered lower income really to be the EJ communities, but that from the Massachusetts maps, that's not entirely true. So I didn't know if you were dealing with the same thing.
Thank you for that question, Christine. That's a really excellent observation. And what I would say is that through the research and the studies overall, there still is a disparity in health and life outcomes based on race, even when holding income constant. So there's still that disparity that persists, which is why there's such a large push on the racial equity policies to really look at closing that equity gap. What I would also share is that there are different ways to approach environmental justice community mapping tools, and a very important distinction between the way that Massachusetts currently has an EJ mapping tool and where California and other mapping tools also approach this is that Massachusetts, and I believe this is consistent with the recent legislation as well, looks at demographic factors only. And I know that there is a, there are trade-offs to any approach you take. So looking at, an EJ community is defined in statute now as meeting one of these three criteria, and they're demographic factors only. If you take a look at the Charles Lee article that I sent a link to here, there is another set of EJ community defining tools or EJ screening tools that combine demographic information with pollution burden. And so in California, we've combined 24 total data sets. Half of them are around demographic information, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and half around pollution burden. And that creates a single score. And we've created sort of relative ranking throughout the state. And so for the office that manages that tool, the approach they've taken through a lot of public input is that they do want to better match up the demographic vulnerabilities with pollution burdens. So that combined score shows what in our statute is disadvantaged communities, that the top 25 relatively ranked highest pollution burden and highest vulnerability census tracts throughout the state. Sorry, that was probably a bit too long of an answer, but I was hoping to share the distinction between.
No, that's great. That's great. I think I'm interested in seeing how everybody else is mapping it. And I think adding that pollution criteria makes a lot of sense, to be perfectly honest. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I was reading a little bit about, and I haven't had the opportunity to connect with some of the Massachusetts leaders in EJ and folks who were advocating in the legislature. But one of the benefits, I think, from the approach that is taken in Massachusetts is that you spend less time sort of really, trying to say this is an EJ community, this is not an EJ community, and you kind of get to focusing on solutions. And so I think that's a very practical and real benefit of using that approach too.
It's an interesting distinction. It's something that we like to think toxic use reduction planning is about as well, really focusing on the solutions. Jill, you had a question. Do you want to ask it? Do you want me to ask it for you?
Yeah, there was racket in the background, which is why I typed it, but it's okay now. Yeah, my question is about, well, in Massachusetts, the TUR planning process is generally focused really inside the facility and almost never actively involves the surrounding community. At DTSC, have you found methods or good ways to moderate or initiate conversations between facilities and the surrounding community to sort of open up those channels of communication?
It's a great question. And as I was referencing earlier, there's been, we're hoping to invest more resources in that work. It's been seen as a need, and we haven't kind of matched our resources at DTSC, I think, to meet that. However, in the other authorities we have around permitted facilities and reviewing and creating conditions on the regulatory side, I think there are some lessons that are and best practice that can be taken from that work and pulled into planning practices as well. So, you know, for any facilities who we work with and inspect on the regulatory side, doing community surveys on a regular basis is a good tool. Having kind of an ongoing list of community leaders and really thoughtfully engaging them in conversations about what concerns they may have about neighboring businesses. And so I will say that aside from the more formal regulatory processes, a number of kind of regional community-based networks have popped up in our state that we support, which is we have our agencies meeting with community members on a monthly basis to just kind of share information about what they're seeing as concerns, and we use those as problem-solving sessions to try and address things not just on a site-by-site basis, but on a regional basis. That takes a lot of partnership, and I know in some of the regions of the state, there have been businesses and local governments that have jumped into those regional networks on a monthly basis. It's a lot of relationship building and trust building. I would just share that as kind of some overall observations on how to do it.
Thanks. You know, it's interesting. I think I know that there are companies who definitely engage with their communities in different programs. So, and that question about trust is like a two-way street. And I think building those relationships with your community, regardless of what the history might be, can be really important work to start and super challenging. There's no question, but worthwhile, because because getting their feedback, getting their input can really be helpful. Any last thoughts or last questions before we wrap it up?
So Pam, I'd just like to encourage everyone, if there are other things that the program can do to assist with you in your planning process, or whenever, as you try to engage your community and think more about the EJ issues, then please let us know. Pam's going to be sending you a survey, I'm sure, but beyond the was this helpful, we'd really love to hear what kinds of follow-up things might be useful for you.
I'm going to create a question in the survey right now. So that's great. So listen, I will be sending out the surveys in the next, half an hour. If by tomorrow morning you haven't received it and you've checked your junk folder and still don't find it, let me know and I can resend it. Again, we are going to email you a final certificate of attendance of the conference once all the sessions are done. So just be patient for that to happen. Again, I want to thank Liz and Tiffany for getting us up to speed on what's happening in the program, and really want to thank you, Ana, for joining us and sharing what you've been learning and thinking about. And really want to commend everybody on the questions and the input that you provided. I'm assuming that we'll be able to get copies of the polling information, because that was just